Welcome, mystery lovers. In this story, we step into the world of Tommy and Tuppence, a pair whose wit and courage have made them unforgettable. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. If you enjoy these mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep new cases coming. Now then, shall we begin? The rain had begun in the early afternoon, a thin, persistent drizzle that blurred the view beyond the Beresfords' front window into wavering patches of grey. By tea-time it had gathered force, rattling against the panes and drumming insistently on the slates of the roof, a weather that encouraged one to stay indoors, close to hearth and lamp. Their modest sitting room in the small house in Soho had always been a place of comfort, but that evening it seemed particularly so. Firelight flickered warmly across the rug, shadows danced across the bookshelves, and the steady hiss of the kettle in the adjoining kitchen promised tea and toast at any moment. Tuppence sat in the armchair nearest the fire, her ankles neatly crossed, a bundle of envelopes resting on her lap. She had been sorting through the day's post with a seriousness that suggested the fate of nations depended on it, though Tommy, sprawled on the sofa opposite, regarded the matter with a good deal less intensity. "Gas bill," she announced, tossing the offending paper onto the table. "And one from your tailor reminding you that you've not had a suit altered since, before the war, I should think. Really, Tommy, a man of your age ought to pay attention to these things." Tommy lifted his head just enough to give her a wounded look. "My age? Good heavens, Tuppence, you make it sound as though I should be in my dotage. I'll have you know this suit is still perfectly serviceable." "Serviceable?" Tuppence echoed, her mouth twitching at the corners. "That is not the most flattering word in the English language, my dear." He grunted amiably and reached for the newspaper on the side table. The fire popped and crackled, sending up a brief shower of sparks, and for a while the only sounds were the rain outside and the rustle of paper as Tuppence worked her way through the stack of envelopes. Most were dull affairs, advertisements, bank statements, circulars addressed with indifferent type. But then her hand paused, fingers tightening slightly around a thin envelope at the bottom of the pile. The handwriting was unmistakably that of an elderly person, slanting, tremulous, the ink smudged in places. The postmark bore the name of a village neither of them recognized, Willowbrook. "That's odd," she murmured, turning it over. "Do we know anyone in Willowbrook?" "Not unless you've been corresponding with strangers behind my back," Tommy replied without looking up from his paper. Ignoring him, she slit the envelope open with a practiced hand and drew out a single sheet of notepaper, creased and slightly yellowed. The words leapt at her immediately, desperate, uneven, as though written under considerable strain. She read aloud, her voice soft but steady. "My name is Mrs. Margaret Vane. I beg of you, come to Willowbrook. There is a dreadful wrong that must be put right. They will not listen to me here, and I am afraid. The truth lies hidden beneath the willow bridge. You are my last hope." The letter ended abruptly, signed in the same shaky hand. Silence followed, broken only by the steady rain. Tuppence stared at the page, her brow furrowed. Tommy lowered his newspaper and regarded her over the top of it with mild curiosity. "Well," he said at last, "that is certainly colourful, but I can't imagine why she's writing to us. We're not in the habit of receiving mysterious pleas for help from lonely widows, are we?" Tuppence laid the paper on the table, smoothing it carefully. "No, but people do write to us now and then when they've nowhere else to turn. Do you remember that girl from Birmingham, the one with the missing brother?" "Yes, and we spent 3 weeks chasing shadows and ended up finding him working quite contentedly in a motor garage under another name. Hardly the stuff of great adventure." "Perhaps not," she admitted, "but there's something about this. The phrasing, it's so peculiar. The truth lies hidden beneath the willow bridge. It sounds almost biblical." Tommy stretched, yawning. "Or like the ravings of someone who's had a little too much sherry before bedtime. A dreadful wrong indeed. Probably some quarrel over parish boundaries or a missing chicken." But Tuppence did not laugh. She tapped the paper thoughtfully with one finger, her eyes distant. "You don't hear the note of fear in it, Tommy? It isn't merely eccentric, it's frightened. Whoever she is, she believes she's in danger. I think we ought to go." He groaned theatrically, sinking back against the cushions. "Go where?" "To Willowbrook, wherever that is. I dare say it's one of those little places where the only excitement is the annual flower show." "That," said Tuppence firmly, is precisely why a dreadful wrong would be all the more terrible there. Imagine a quiet village, everyone knowing everyone else, and beneath it all, a secret no one dares to speak of. That sort of thing festers, Tommy. The kettle whistled from the kitchen, a shrill counterpoint to the rain, and she rose to pour the tea. When she returned with the tray, 2 cups, milk jug, plate of buttered scones, Tommy had picked up the letter and was reading it with a frown. "She doesn't give any details," he said slowly. "No hint of what sort of wrong or why she thinks we're the ones to help her." "That makes it more intriguing, don't you think?" Tuppence handed him a cup and sat down again. "Besides, there may be a reason she chose us. Perhaps she read about our earlier cases. We have had our names in the papers once or twice." "Not always for flattering reasons," Tommy reminded her dryly, but he was watching her with a certain fond resignation. He knew that look on her face, the spark in her eyes, the tilt of her chin. Once Tuppence's curiosity was engaged, there was little hope of dissuading her. The firelight gleamed on the brass clock on the mantelpiece, its hands creeping towards 7. Outside, the rain lashed harder, wind driving it against the glass. The house seemed small but snug, a little island of warmth in the storm. Tommy sipped his tea, considering. "All right," he said at last. "Suppose we do go. What exactly are we looking for? Some long-lost treasure beneath a bridge? A ghostly apparition? Or do you imagine this Mrs. Vane intends to meet us with a lantern at midnight and whisper dark secrets into our ears?" Tuppence laughed, though it was a short, almost uneasy laugh. "Whatever it is, it matters enough for her to send this. And you know perfectly well, Tommy Beresford, that you'd be disappointed if we ignored it and nothing came of it." He tilted his head, conceding the point. Adventure, however mild, had always had a way of finding them, or perhaps of being sought by them when the domestic routine threatened to grow dull. And though he would not admit it readily, there was a thrill in the thought of leaving behind the rain-soaked city streets for a countryside mystery. "Well then," he said, setting down his cup with decision, "we'll look up the train to Willowbrook in the morning. But mind you, Tuppence, if it turns out to be nothing more than a lost sheep, you'll owe me a decent bottle of brandy." "Done," she replied, her eyes shining, "though I suspect it will be something rather more than a sheep." The letter lay between them on the table, its ink faintly blurred, the wavering lines hinting at secrets untold. The fire burned lower, shadows deepened along the walls, and outside the storm pressed closer against the little house. As the clock chimed the hour, Tommy rose to draw the curtains, shutting out the dark. Tuppence remained by the hearth, gazing at the letter, already imagining the village of Willowbrook, the looming bridge, and the secrets whispered beneath its stones. She felt a ripple of anticipation, touched with unease, as though by opening that envelope she had stepped across an unseen threshold. Tomorrow they would travel to a place they had never heard of, summoned by the trembling hand of a stranger. Whatever lay beneath the willow bridge, it was waiting for them. And in that warm, firelit room, as the rain beat its steady tattoo, both Beresfords knew, though neither said it aloud, that their lives were about to be unsettled once more. The following morning dawned with reluctant light, as though London itself had no great wish to part with the fog that clung stubbornly to its streets. By the time Tommy and Tuppence reached the station, the mist had turned to drizzle once more, the sort of half-hearted rain that seeps into collars and spirits alike. Yet Tuppence was brisk as ever, umbrella firmly in hand, eyes alight with curiosity. Tommy carried their modest case with the air of a man resigned to the inevitable. The train journey was uneventful at first, suburban sprawl giving way to rolling fields patched with hedgerows, the occasional church spire breaking the horizon. But as they drew nearer to their destination, the landscape grew more dramatic. Low hills pressed in, their slopes clothed in dark woodland, and a river glinted intermittently between the trees, catching what little light the day afforded. The train slowed, brakes squealing, and came at last to rest beside a small, lonely platform marked with a painted sign, Willowbrook. The station itself seemed a relic from another century. A single porter in a frayed uniform lifted their case with a nod, his eyes sliding over them with the mild suspicion of one unaccustomed to newcomers. Beyond the station stretched a lane, its cobbles wet with rain, leading down toward the heart of the village. They walked on together, the air cool and damp, their breath faintly visible. The houses they passed were modest stone cottages with mossy roofs and narrow windows, many with small gardens fenced by leaning gates. Chickens pecked indifferently at puddles, and the only sounds were the caw of rooks and the steady rush of the unseen river. "It's a picturesque little place," Tommy observed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "Picturesque and secretive," Tuppence returned. She had noticed curtains twitching as they passed, faces half hidden behind panes of glass. The village seemed to regard them with collective caution, as though strangers were unusual and perhaps unwelcome. The lane widened into a square where a handful of shops huddled together, a grocer's, a post office, and most invitingly, the sign of an inn swinging from a beam above a low doorway. The painted board bore the name The King's Arms in faded gilt, its once proud lion weathered almost smooth. Inside, the inn was dim but warm, the scent of wood smoke mingling with that of ale and cooking meat. A fire glowed in the hearth, though the patrons gathered there gave little sign of cheer. Conversation stilled as Tommy and Tuppence entered, the kind of pause that carries more weight than silence. The innkeeper, a thick-set man with thinning hair, bustled forward with forced geniality. "Rooms, is it? Or just a bite and a pint?" "Rooms, I think," said Tommy, placing the case on the worn counter. "And perhaps a spot of lunch. We've just arrived." "From London?" the man asked, though he clearly already guessed the answer. "Yes," Tuppence said pleasantly. "We're here to see a Mrs. Vane." That produced the faintest stir among the assembled drinkers. A chair scraped, a cough was muffled, and one man muttered something to his neighbour. The innkeeper's eyes flickered, then returned to a studied blankness. "Mrs. Vane, eh? You'll find her cottage down by the river past the bridge, though she's not much for visitors." "We were invited," Tuppence replied lightly, as though daring him to contradict her. They were shown to a modest room upstairs, where the bed sagged and the curtains smelled faintly of damp. After a quick wash and change of shoes, they returned to the common room for lunch. The inn served stew, hearty and steaming, though the meat was of indeterminate origin. As they ate, Tommy's ears pricked at the low murmur of conversation from a nearby table. Two men, their caps pulled low, spoke in voices meant to be discreet but which carried nonetheless. Said it was an accident, but everyone knows better. "Best not talk of it, lad. Nothing good comes of stirring old water." Their eyes shifted briefly toward the window, where the outline of the bridge was visible through the mist, an ancient span of stone, ivy trailing from its sides, arching over the restless current below. Even from a distance it had a brooding presence, its silhouette etched against the pale sky. Tuppence followed their gaze, her expression thoughtful. "That must be the Willow Bridge," she murmured. "Yes, and it looks as though it could swallow secrets as easily as it swallows shadows," Tommy said, leaning back. Before she could reply, an elderly man at the bar turned toward them. His face was lined, his eyes watery but sharp. He raised a finger, wagged it solemnly, and muttered just loudly enough for them to hear, "Best leave old bridges alone." Then he returned to his tankard, ignoring the curious looks of the others. Tuppence straightened in her chair. "Well," she whispered, "if that isn't the clearest invitation I've ever heard, I don't know what is." Tommy chuckled ruefully. "Trust you to take a warning as encouragement." Still, the unease was undeniable. The villagers' glances, the murmured conversations, the strange weight that seemed to hang about the place, all hinted that their arrival had stirred something long dormant. When they stepped outside after the meal, the mist had thickened, curling in slow eddies along the riverbank. The bridge loomed closer now, massive and ancient, its stones slick with ivy and rain. Beneath its arch, the water surged darkly, carrying fragments of leaves and broken branches, as though sweeping away whispers the village refused to voice aloud. They paused at the edge of the square, the inn's door closing behind them, the murmur of voices fading. For a moment, they stood in silence, listening to the river's steady roar. Tuppence drew her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Whatever happened here, Tommy, they've gone to great lengths to bury it. But secrets don't stay buried forever." Tommy tucked his hands into his pockets, eyeing the bridge with reluctant respect. "Let's hope we don't end up being buried with them." The mist rolled on, swallowing the edges of the village as the Beresfords prepared to seek out Mrs. Vane and the mystery she had called them into. The path to Mrs. Vane's cottage wound away from the village square, following the river as it curved beneath drooping willows and overgrown hedges. Mist clung low along the bank, and the sound of rushing water was constant, sometimes gentle, sometimes ominous, depending on how the current struck the bridge supports. Tommy and Tuppence walked side by side, their shoes crunching on gravel, eyes occasionally lifting to the silhouette of the bridge that loomed above them. In the grey light, it looked almost medieval, a spine of stone arched against the sky, ivy dangling like a shroud. The cottage appeared suddenly, tucked beneath a copse of leaning birches. It was a humble structure, slate roof patchy with moss, whitewashed walls flaking, the garden gone wild with weeds. A faint curl of smoke rose from the crooked chimney, but the windows stared blankly, their glass dulled by grime. Tuppence rapped smartly on the door. There was a pause, long enough to make them wonder if the house was deserted, before the latch creaked and the door opened a cautious inch. Mrs. Margaret Vane stood there, framed by darkness within. She was smaller than either had imagined, a frail woman swathed in a shawl, her silver hair pinned haphazardly. Her eyes, though, were bright and restless, darting from Tommy to Tuppence, then beyond them to the lane, as though fearful of pursuit. "You came," she whispered, as though scarcely daring to believe it. Then, stepping back, she beckoned them inside. The air of the cottage was heavy with the scent of damp wood and dried herbs. A single oil lamp burned on a table, its light catching stacks of yellowed newspapers and books piled haphazardly on every surface. The walls bore old photographs, their frames tarnished, their subjects gazing out in sepia tones, stiff family portraits, men in uniforms, a wedding couple frozen in joy long past. "Please sit," Mrs. Vane urged, her voice trembling. She settled into a wicker chair opposite, clasping her hands tightly as though to keep them from shaking. "I feared you might not believe me. I feared you would ignore my letter. But you are here, and that means there is hope." Tuppence, ever the gentler in such matters, leaned forward with a reassuring smile. "Of course we came. Your words carried urgency. Tell us what troubles you." Mrs. Vane's eyes filled with sudden tears, though she brushed them away impatiently. "It is my husband. They said he drowned. That is what they all say, that he stumbled, that the current was too strong, but he did not drown by chance. He was silenced." Tommy shifted uneasily. "Silenced? You mean—" "Murdered," she whispered, her gaze sharp. "Because of what he knew, because of what he found beneath the Willow Bridge." A silence fell, broken only by the ticking of a clock somewhere in the shadows. Tuppence exchanged a quick glance with Tommy, then asked softly, "And what was it he found?" Mrs. Vane's hands twisted in her lap. "A ledger, an old book of accounts kept hidden in the stonework. My husband discovered it by accident one summer evening. He was always curious about the bridge. It fascinated him. He said it was older than the village itself, that it had been hiding secrets since before any of us were born. And then one day he returned pale as death, clutching pages of figures, names, sums that made no sense. He told me it was dangerous knowledge. He said some of the most respected men in Willowbrook would rather kill than see it revealed." Her voice cracked. She looked toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. Tommy leaned back, his tone practical. "Do you still have this ledger?" "No." She shook her head violently. "They took it, or rather someone did, after he was gone. But he made a copy. He was clever that way. I do not know where it is, but I believe he left a clue. I have searched, but they watch me. They whisper, they wait for me to slip." She rose suddenly, moving to a cupboard. From within she drew a small object and placed it into Tuppence's hand. It was a brass key, worn smooth by years of handling, the bow engraved with a faded floral pattern. "This," she said urgently. "This opens the way to the truth. I do not know what lock it belongs to, but he pressed it into my palm the night before he died. He told me, 'Keep it safe, Margaret. If anything happens, it will lead them to the truth.' And so I kept it. I have trusted no one until now." Tuppence closed her fingers around the key. It was surprisingly warm, as though it carried with it the memory of the man who once guarded it. She looked into Mrs. Vane's eyes and said gently, "We will do all we can." Mrs. Vane gripped her hand with desperate strength. "Be careful. The village smiles, but behind those smiles are knives. They will not hesitate to strike again." A sound interrupted her, the faint crunch of gravel outside the window. All three froze. The lamplight flickered, shadows shifting across the room. Tuppence thought she saw movement, a dark shape slipping past the glass, gone as quickly as it appeared. Mrs. Vane gasped, her frailty suddenly clear. "They are watching," she whispered. "They never let me be." Tommy moved quickly to the door, flinging it open. The lane lay empty, mist curling thick and impenetrable. The only sound was the rush of the river. Whoever had passed by was gone. He closed the door again, locking it firmly. "It could be nothing," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Mrs. Vane murmured. "It is never nothing here." For a few moments the three sat in silence, the weight of her words pressing heavily upon them. The brass key gleamed faintly in Tuppence's hand, a symbol of the mystery they had stumbled into, and of the danger that already closed around them. When at last they rose to leave, Mrs. Vane followed them to the door, her frail figure outlined against the dim lamplight. "Go carefully," she said, her voice low. "Trust no one, not the doctor, not the curate, not even the constable. They are all bound together in silence. Only the truth can break it, and the truth lies beneath the Willow Bridge." The door closed behind them with a hollow thud. The night air was chill, the mist denser than before, pressing close like a living thing. Tommy and Tuppence stood for a moment in the lane, the key secure in Tuppence's pocket, the river's voice echoing in their ears. "Well," Tommy muttered at last, "this promises to be cheerful. Murder, conspiracies, mysterious keys, and a village full of suspects. Just the sort of restful holiday you had in mind, I suppose." Tuppence smiled faintly, though her eyes were serious. "You must admit, Tommy, it's far more interesting than lost sheep." Together they turned back toward the inn, the shadow of the bridge stretching across their path, as if to remind them of the secrets it guarded still. Dusk came early to Willowbrook. The mist, which had hung low all afternoon, thickened into veils of grey and mauve, swallowing the outlines of the cottages and softening the edges of the fields beyond. Lamps glowed faintly in windows, but the heart of the village seemed to retreat into silence as night crept closer. For Tommy and Tuppence the hour carried a strange pull, an insistence that they see for themselves the bridge that dominated so many whispered conversations. The path led them from the square along the riverbank, where reeds bowed under the weight of moisture and the air smelled of moss and running water. The river itself was swollen from days of rain, its current swift and restless, breaking in white froth against hidden stones. When at last the bridge came into view, it loomed like some ancient sentinel, its arch rising broad and dark against the dimming sky. Ivy trailed thickly down its sides, and the stonework, though weathered by centuries, bore an aura of endurance, as though it had been built not merely to cross the river, but to outlast time itself. They paused at the approach, both instinctively quiet. The river's roar seemed louder beneath the arch, magnified by the narrowing of the banks. The bridge exuded a kind of authority, as though it demanded silence and caution from those who dared cross. Tuppence ran her gloved hand along the balustrade as they ascended. The stone was slick with rain, rough beneath her touch. Then she stopped abruptly. "Look here, Tommy." He bent beside her. In the fading light, faint but clear, were scratches, gouges in the stone that had not yet been softened by weather. They ran in uneven lines, some shallow, some deeper, as though made in haste by a sharp tool. "Fresh," Tuppence whispered. "These weren't here years ago. Someone has been working at this stone." Tommy frowned. "Not carving initials, that's certain. It looks deliberate, as if someone were trying to force something loose." Her eyes moved instinctively toward the ivy-covered supports, the shadowed cavities beneath the arch. The bridge seemed suddenly less a structure than a keeper of secrets, its stones heavy with hidden purpose. They crossed to the centre, pausing to gaze down at the turbulent water. The current twisted like dark ribbons, carrying leaves and debris. It was easy to imagine a body lost to those waters, carried swiftly away and never seen again. A sound behind them made them turn sharply. From the village side, a figure approached, slender, stoop-shouldered, with the unmistakable air of a clergyman. His black coat flapped in the wind, and the brim of his hat shadowed his pale face. "Good evening," he said, halting as though surprised to find the bridge already occupied. "Good evening," Tuppence returned pleasantly. "You're out rather late, aren't you?" The man hesitated before replying. I often walk here at dusk. The river clears the mind. His voice was soft, yet carried an undertone of unease. Tommy studied him. The man's hands, clasped before him, trembled slightly. His eyes flicked from the Beresfords to the water and back again, never resting. "You're the curate, I take it?" Tommy asked. "Yes, Mr. Fellows." The man inclined his head, though the movement was stiff. "And you are the visitors staying at the inn. The village has noticed." "Has it indeed?" Tuppence said with mild amusement. "We've noticed too." For a moment silence pressed in, the rush of the river, the creak of the bridge beneath their feet. Then Mr. Fellows spoke again, his tone lowered, urgent. "Curiosity can be a temptation," he said. "Temptation leads to danger. I would advise caution. Sometimes it is better not to seek what lies hidden." With that cryptic remark he gave a stiff nod and moved on, his thin figure swallowed by the mist at the far end of the bridge. Tommy exhaled, shaking his head. "Well, that was subtle, wasn't it? A clergyman telling us not to pry. You'd think he'd want sins dragged into the light, not kept under mossy stones." Tuppence was thoughtful. Fear can twist even the most righteous. Did you see how he trembled? He knows something. They continued to the far side, where the lane dipped into shadow. As they turned back toward the village, voices carried faintly from below, low, urgent tones, barely audible over the rush of water. Tommy gestured for silence, and they crept to the balustrade, peering cautiously down. Two men stood near the riverbank beneath the bridge, their forms little more than shapes in the mist. One wore a cap pulled low, the other had broad shoulders and a heavy stance. Their words drifted upward, snatched by the wind but still distinct enough. "The chest. Can't risk it being found. Keep it buried. Too many questions already." The rest was lost, drowned by the river's roar, but the fragments chilled the Beresfords nonetheless. "A chest," Tuppence whispered. What else could they mean but the one Mrs. Vane spoke of? Tommy's eyes narrowed. "It seems her story has more weight than we thought." They crouched in silence, straining to catch more. The taller man shifted, gesturing toward the water. "If anyone suspects, we're finished. It stays where it is. No one will dare look, not after what happened to Vane." The shorter man muttered something indistinct, then spat into the river. A moment later both figures moved off, vanishing into the dark. Tommy and Tuppence remained still until the echoes of their footsteps faded. Then Tommy straightened, brushing damp from his coat. "Well, there we have it. A chest, secrets, and the late Mr. Vane conveniently drowned. What do you make of it, partner?" "That we're walking straight into the middle of something larger than Mrs. Vane's fears," Tuppence replied. Her gaze lingered on the stonework, the fresh scratches, the ivy that seemed almost to conceal a hidden door. "And that this bridge is more than a crossing, it's a vault." They made their way back to the inn, the bridge behind them looming in the fog, its silence as eloquent as the words they had overheard. The village seemed to draw in on itself as night fully fell, doors shut tight, shutters fastened, lamps snuffed. Only the King's Arms still offered light and warmth, though even there the air carried a wariness, as though the shadows themselves had ears. Inside they found the innkeeper polishing glasses behind the counter. He looked up quickly, eyes sharp, then too casually returned to his task. The fire in the hearth crackled, but the few patrons spoke in low tones, their laughter forced. Tommy ordered 2 pints and they settled near the fire. Tuppence leaned in, voice barely above a murmur. "What do you think? Was one of those men the innkeeper himself?" Tommy shrugged. "The height fits, but it's hard to say in this fog. And we've yet to meet the mill owner everyone mutters about. Big man, influential. He might be our broad-shouldered friend." The innkeeper's ears twitched, though his face betrayed nothing. He brought their drinks with studied cheer. "Long walk, was it? River's not safe at night. Folks say it plays tricks on the ears." "Does it indeed?" Tuppence replied lightly. "Funny, I thought I heard voices." The innkeeper smiled thinly, set down the pints and withdrew without another word. Tommy raised his glass, meeting Tuppence's eyes. "Well, darling, it seems Willowbrook is determined to give us material for at least a week. We've got nervous curates, secret chests, and innkeepers who listen a little too closely. Add a domineering mill owner to the mix, and we've the makings of quite a play." Tuppence sipped her ale, her gaze fixed on the flames. "It isn't a play for Mrs. Vane. It cost her husband his life. We mustn't forget that." The fire popped, casting sparks into the gloom. Outside, the mist pressed close against the windows, and the river roared unseen in the dark. The bridge stood silent once more, keeper of its secrets, brooding over the village that dared not name them. And within the inn, two strangers from London had begun to disturb the silence, stirring echoes that had long been buried beneath the stones of Willowbrook. The next morning broke with a chill brightness, the kind of light that seemed too clean for a village steeped in whispers. A cock crowed somewhere, though it sounded more like protest than greeting. Tommy was halfway through buttering a slice of toast in the inn's dining room when the innkeeper shuffled in, face grave, wiping his hands on a towel already grey with use. "You'll have heard by now," he said without preamble. Tommy looked up. Heard what? The innkeeper's eyes flicked toward Tuppence, who was seated opposite, her tea untouched. "Mrs. Vane passed in the night." The words dropped like stones into water, rippling outward in silence. Tuppence's hand stilled on the rim of her cup. "Passed?" she repeated quietly. "How?" The innkeeper shrugged, too brisk. "Her heart, they say. Weak as it was, no surprise really." He turned away before either could answer, muttering about guests and chores. Tommy set down his knife with a sigh. "Well, that was quick, wasn't it? Yesterday she entrusts us with a key. Today she's gone." "Gone too soon," Tuppence said, her voice sharp with something that was not grief but indignation. "Her manner last night. Yes, she was frail but not at death's door. No, Tommy, this isn't coincidence." Before long, the bell in the small church began to toll, its notes heavy and funereal, carrying over the mist-clad roofs of the village. The sound seemed to summon people into the lanes, hushed knots of villagers forming and dispersing like shadows. Tommy and Tuppence followed the slow procession toward the cottage. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of camphor. Mrs. Vane lay in her bed, her face composed, lips pressed together as though still withholding secrets. The doctor was there, a plump man with pince-nez that pinched his nose into severity. "Fragile as glass, that one," he told them when they entered. "I warned her more than once. The heart will only take so much strain. Nothing to be done." Tuppence bent near the bedside, studying the still form with the kind of careful attention that drew a frown from the doctor. Her eyes lingered on the wrist, where faint marks, darker than the skin, irregular, stood out. She said nothing, only straightened and thanked him. Out in the lane, she turned sharply to Tommy. "Did you see them? The bruises?" He nodded grimly. "Yes," and the doctor was far too quick with his tidy explanation. The brass key weighed heavy in her pocket, their only link now to the truth Mrs. Vane had died for. Tuppence touched it unconsciously, as though reassured by its presence. The funeral was arranged with unseemly haste. Within 2 days the churchyard was filled with villagers dressed in sombre attire, their faces drawn into masks of solemnity. The curate, Mr. Fellows, conducted the service, his voice wavering as though he too carried burdens unspoken. Tommy and Tuppence stood among the mourners observing. Few wept, most stood stiffly, glancing sidelong at one another, their silence heavy with meanings unspoken. When the coffin was lowered into the earth, the scrape of ropes loud against the hush, Tuppence felt a shiver. It was not only a woman being buried, but her secrets too, and some in the crowd, she thought, looked a little too relieved. As soil thudded onto the lid, Tommy leaned close. You see their eyes? Not grief, fear, or worse, satisfaction. Tuppence's lips pressed together. Then we must ensure she hasn't died for nothing. I owe her that much. Later, as the mourners dispersed, a constable approached them. He was a solid fellow with broad shoulders, his cap pulled low, eyes darting to be sure no one was listening. "You'll forgive me saying so," he murmured, "but her passing solves a problem for certain folk." Tuppence's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, shifting his weight. "She made enemies, did Mrs. Vane. Kept talking of things better left unsaid. The village has long memories and short tempers when it comes to old scandals. Now, well, the air will be quieter." Tommy regarded him steadily. "And you, Constable? Do you believe it was heart failure?" The man's jaw tightened. "I believe in doing my duty, sir, and my duty's to keep the peace. Best not to stir what lies beneath." With that, he tipped his cap and strode away. Tuppence watched him go, anger bright in her eyes. He knows. They all know. And none of them will speak. That leaves us. They walked back through the square, the sound of the river following them. The bridge loomed once more in the distance, ivy clinging like fingers, stones glistening damp. It seemed to Tuppence that the whole village revolved around it, as though the bridge's shadow extended into every corner of life here. At the inn that evening, the atmosphere was strained. The common room, usually filled with low chatter, was hushed. Men hunched over pints, women whispered together, glancing up whenever the Beresfords entered. The innkeeper served their supper without a word, his eyes fixed on the floor. Tommy stirred his stew thoughtfully. "So, what now? We've lost our witness. All we have is that key." Tuppence placed it on the table between them, the lamplight catching its worn brass. "A key implies a lock. Somewhere in this village is what Mr. Vane wanted found. We'll search every drawer, every chest if we must." Tommy leaned back, his voice lower. "And suppose the chest those men spoke of is real. Suppose it lies beneath the bridge, as Mrs. Vane said. That's not something we can go prizing open in daylight without half the village upon us." "Then we'll wait for night," Tuppence replied, her eyes unwavering. "We'll wait for the moment they least expect." The murmur of conversation around them faltered briefly, as if someone had heard. Tuppence glanced up to see the innkeeper watching them from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but he looked away too quickly. That night, as they retired to their room, Tuppence paused by the window, gazing down at the square. Figures moved in the fog, indistinct, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent. "Tommy," she whispered, "this village is holding its breath, and Mrs. Vane's death has only tightened the silence." He joined her at the window, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Then we'll be the ones to break it." The clock in the hall struck 10. Outside, the river surged, carrying with it the weight of secrets, and the bridge stood against the night, keeper of truths that others would kill to protect. And in their room above the inn, the Beresfords lay awake, the brass key between them on the bedside table, gleaming faintly in the dark like a promise and a threat. Sunday morning dawned with a brittle sunlight, thin and watery as it fell through the mist that clung to Willowbrook. The bell of St. Agnes's Church tolled in slow, measured strokes, summoning the faithful, though the sound seemed less like an invitation than a warning. Tommy and Tuppence lingered at the churchyard gate, their breath clouding faintly in the crisp air. The church stood squat and ancient, its grey stones mottled with lichen, its tower leaning ever so slightly, as though bowing under centuries of secrets. Gravestones leaned in crooked rows around it, many so weathered that names and dates had dissolved into anonymity. "It's the sort of place that smells of dust and guilt," Tommy muttered, glancing up at the arched windows. "Which is exactly why Mr. Vane may have chosen it," Tuppence replied. Her hand rested in her pocket, fingers brushing the brass key. He was a clever man. Clever men hide things where others least expect them. They entered with the rest of the small congregation. Inside, the nave was dim, the air carrying the faint odour of damp stone and candle wax. Pews creaked under the weight of villagers settling in their places, and the curate, Mr. Fellows, stood near the altar, nervously shuffling his papers. His eyes flickered across the room, fastening for a fraction too long on the Beresfords. The service was brief, though not without its peculiar tension. Mr. Fellows stumbled over passages, his voice catching at odd intervals, as though some unseen weight pressed upon him. When the last hymn ended and the villagers began to file out, Tommy touched Tuppence's arm. "Now or never," he murmured. They slipped discreetly into the side aisle and toward the vestry, the little chamber that branched off behind the altar. The door was heavy oak, the iron handle cold in Tuppence's hand. She turned it, half expecting resistance, but it opened with a groan. Inside, the vestry smelled of old wood polish and mildew. A row of vestments hung limply, their colours faded. Cupboards lined one wall, drawers stacked beneath them, and there in the far corner was a small writing desk, its surface littered with hymnals and papers. One drawer, unlike the rest, bore a small brass lock. Tuppence's eyes lit with recognition. "The key," she whispered. From her pocket she produced the little object, its worn bow fitting snugly in her fingers. She knelt, slid it into the lock, and felt the mechanism turn with a satisfying click. The drawer slid open. Inside lay a book, a ledger, thick, water-stained, its cover warped. The edges of its pages were swollen, discoloured by damp. Tuppence lifted it carefully, as though it might crumble in her hands. "Mr. Vane's," she murmured. "It must be." They laid it on the desk and opened it. The handwriting inside was neat at first, lines of figures, columns of sums, names noted in the margin. But as the pages turned, the order faltered. Ink had blurred where water had seeped. Whole names were smudged into illegibility. Some lines bore dark scratches as though someone had tried to obscure them deliberately. Tommy bent over, whistling low. "These are payments, regular ones too, large sums going out from the mill and not to suppliers or workers. Look here, allowance, hush fund, stipend, it's all code for bribery." "And blackmail," Tuppence added grimly, pointing to a page where a single word remained visible above a blurred blot. "Threats." Her eyes scanned the margins. Names appeared, village names, a doctor, a constable, even Mr. Fellows, the curate, though the line after his name had been smeared to near nothing. "It's all here," she whispered, "proof that the mill has been bleeding money to keep people silent." No wonder Mr. Vane was silenced himself. He must have threatened to expose it. The door creaked suddenly, and both started. Mr. Fellows stood framed in the doorway, his thin hands trembling at his sides. His face was pale, his eyes darting to the ledger. "You mustn't," he stammered. "That book, it does no good. Leave it where it belongs, nothing but harm will come from it." Tuppence snapped the ledger shut, holding it close. "Why, Mr. Fellows? If it's harmless, why fear it?" His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Because it will destroy what little peace remains in this village. Because some truths cannot be borne. Please give it to me. You cannot understand." Tommy straightened, his tone sharp. "What we understand is that a woman is dead, her husband before her, and this ledger ties half the village to corruption. Now, unless you'd like to explain why your own name appears in these pages, I suggest you step aside." The curate flinched as though struck. His lips opened, closed again. Then, with a strangled sound, he stepped back, pressing himself against the doorframe. His eyes darted once more to the ledger, burning with fear, but he made no move to stop them. Tommy and Tuppence brushed past him, the book hidden beneath Tommy's coat. Outside, the churchyard was empty, save for the corps of rooks circling overhead. The sun had retreated behind the mist, and the cold seemed sharper, the world more brittle. They hurried back to the inn, where they spread the ledger on their small table and began to study it by lamplight. Hours passed as they pieced together what fragments they could. It was like reconstructing a broken mirror, some shards clear, others clouded, gaps everywhere. Yet the reflection that emerged was unmistakable. The mill, long the economic heart of Willowbrook, had also been its festering wound. Profits had been siphoned to pay off men and women who threatened exposure, employees who had seen unsafe practices, villagers who had caught wind of fraud, perhaps even lovers with indiscretions to sell. At least one entry suggested that hush money had been paid to cover an accident, a drowning perhaps. Tuppence tapped the page. This line here, "The sum is the largest of all, paid just before Mr. Vane's death." Could that be the price of silence, or the price of murder? Tommy rubbed his chin. "We'll never know unless we find the missing pages. Someone's tried to blot out names, deliberately, which means someone knows precisely what this ledger proves." Their conversation was interrupted by a faint sound in the corridor outside, a board creaking, a step retreating. Tuppence rose swiftly, flinging open the door, but the hallway was empty. Only the lingering scent of pipe smoke suggested someone had lingered there. She closed the door again, locking it firmly. "They know we've found it, and now we're in the same danger Mrs. Vane feared." Tommy sat back, the ledger still open, its pages fluttering in the draught. "So much for a quiet countryside visit. We've gone from sheep and stew to bribery, murder, and missing pages." Tuppence's eyes gleamed. Exactly the sort of thing we were made for. They sat in silence for a while, the lamplight flickering across their faces, the ledger's inked words casting long shadows. Beyond the window, the river rushed darkly, its voice carrying through the mist. For the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, The Beresfords understood the scale of what they had stepped into. This was not merely the tragedy of one widow and her drowned husband. This was corruption woven into the very fabric of the village, its church, its constable, its doctor, perhaps its very economy. The brass key had opened more than a drawer. It had opened a door into a secret world, one that others would kill to keep closed. And as the night deepened, the question lingered like the tolling of the church bell. Had Mrs. Vane been silenced not for her frail heart, but for the strength of what she held in trust? The ledger lay locked in their case, but its weight seemed to linger in the air of the inn-room. Tommy and Tuppence sat opposite each other at the small table, the lamp burning low, the muted sounds of the village drifting through the shutters, the names they had read, the half-smeared lines, the hints of bribery and silence. They were enough to tighten the noose of suspicion around nearly everyone they had met since setting foot in Willowbrook. 3 names we cannot ignore, Tuppence said firmly. The mill owner for one. All roads lead back to him. The innkeeper, too watchful by half. And Mr. Fellows, who quivers like a man with chains on his conscience. Those 3 know something vital. And we're just the ones to make them talk, Tommy replied. But his voice held less cheer than usual. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. We'll need to tread carefully. The villagers aren't simply suspicious, they're hostile. One false move and we'll find ourselves bundled onto the next train with polite wishes never to return. Then we won't make a false move, Tuppence said briskly. We'll make calculated ones. The mill dominated the eastern edge of the village, its red brick walls stained with soot, its tall chimney stabbing the mist. Though once proud, its hum was now intermittent, as though labouring with the weight of years. They arrived in the late morning, boots crunching on gravel, and were received in a panelled office where the mill's master sat behind a wide desk. Mr. Carraway was a big man, shoulders filling his chair, hair greying at the temples but thick, his hands broad and heavy. His smile was polite, but it never reached his eyes. "So," he said, voice smooth, "the London couple. I've heard whispers of you, poking about where there's no call to poke." "We prefer to call it listening," Tuppence said sweetly. Carraway's eyes flicked toward her. Dangerous pastime, listening, especially in a village where people guard their peace. Tommy leaned on the desk, deliberately casual. "We've been listening to talk of ledgers and payments, Mr. Carraway. Talk that begins at your mill. Perhaps you'd care to clear the air." The man's smile hardened. Every business keeps accounts. Every account has entries that outsiders may misunderstand. That's the trouble with poking about. You start to see monsters in shadows. "But some shadows do hold monsters," Tuppence countered softly. Carraway rose, his bulk filling the room. "Take care," he said evenly. "The river runs fast here. It's claimed more than one careless life." They left with nothing tangible, but the menace in his words clung like damp mist. That afternoon they returned to the King's Arms. The innkeeper, Mr. Dobbs, was behind the bar, polishing glasses that already gleamed. His eyes followed them with a careful blankness. "Quiet day," Tommy remarked, sliding onto a stool. "Funny thing, quiet villages. They often hum louder beneath the surface." Dobbs grunted. "City folk talk too much." Tuppence leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "We know Mrs. Vane confided in us because she trusted no one here. Perhaps you know why." His hand paused, the cloth freezing mid-polish. Then he set the glass down firmly. "She was old. Old folks see shadows where there are none." "And yet," Tuppence pressed, "she died the night after speaking to us. Rather convenient for certain people, wouldn't you say?" Dobbs's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Only when another customer entered did he retreat to the back room, leaving their questions unanswered. His silence was as telling as words. Evening found them in the vicarage garden, where Mr. Fellows paced nervously among the bare rose bushes. His hands fluttered like trapped birds when he saw them. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "It isn't safe to keep digging." "Then help us," Tuppence urged. "If you truly fear what lies beneath, guide us to the truth. Why is your name in the ledger? Why does fear ride your every word?" The curate's lips trembled. I received money, yes, but not for myself. For repairs to the church roof. I never asked where it came from. I told myself it was a donation, nothing more. But when Mr. Vane spoke of exposing it, I knew the truth. Hush money, paid through me. "And you said nothing," Tommy remarked dryly. Fellows bowed his head. "What could I do? The village depends on the mill. To accuse Caraway would be to tear the heart out of Willowbrook." "Better torn than poisoned," Tuppence said sharply. But Fellows only wrung his hands, his fear greater than his conscience. They left him pacing in the shadows, his figure hunched as though the weight of the church itself pressed on his shoulders. The following day a new whisper stirred the square. A travelling salesman, they said, had been seen near the bridge on the night of Mr. Vane's death. A stranger carrying a heavy case, his manner furtive. The tale spread quickly, seizing upon the relief of suspicion directed outward. Tommy and Tuppence tracked the story to its source, a woman at the grocer's who swore she glimpsed him through her curtains. "He stood under the bridge arch," she insisted, "by lantern light. Shifty sort, I could tell." But when pressed, her tale faltered. Had she truly seen his face? No, too dark. The case? Perhaps it was only a bundle. By evening, no one could recall his name nor produce a shred of evidence he had existed. A useful fiction, Tommy concluded, to distract from the uncomfortable truth that the danger lies within the village, not without. "And one they're only too eager to believe," Tuppence added. "Fear of strangers is easier than suspicion of neighbours." That night, back at the inn, they reviewed their findings. Names filled Tuppence's notebook. Caraway, Dobbs, Fellows. Each had a motive: money, reputation, fear. The ledger tied them all to silence. Tommy stretched, the chair creaking beneath him. "The way I see it, we're not chasing a single crime, but a tapestry. The drowning of Mr. Vane, the death of his widow, the hush money, all threads knotted beneath that bridge." Tuppence nodded. "It isn't only one wrong, it's years of them. The bridge hides not just a chest, but a history. Each stone is heavy with it. And the villagers know, if the truth surfaces, it will damn them all." They fell silent, listening to the river beyond the window, its steady rush like a heartbeat in the dark. The inn had grown still, but the air was thick with unsaid words, footsteps creaking faintly in distant corridors, as though shadows themselves were eavesdropping. Tuppence's voice was firm at last. "We're close, Tommy. Too close for them to allow us much longer. If we don't uncover it soon, the river may claim more than just the veins." He met her gaze, a wry smile touching his lips. "Well then, partner, we'd best make sure the river's appetite is disappointed." The lamp guttered, throwing their shadows large against the wall, and in the silence that followed, the old inn seemed to lean closer, listening. The night lay heavy upon Willowbrook, moonlight pale against drifting banks of mist that clung to the river. The village slept, shutters drawn, chimneys dark, but in the common room of the King's Arms, two figures waited with deliberate patience. Tommy and Tuppence sat near the hearth, pretending to linger over late-night drinks, though the fire had burned low and their cups had long gone cold. Every creak of the inn's timbers seemed amplified, every gust of wind against the windows an omen. At last, Tommy set down his glass. "Time," Tuppence nodded. She had dressed in dark colours, her scarf drawn close, the brass key concealed in her pocket. Tommy checked his watch, 11:45, and together they slipped from the inn, careful to avoid the innkeeper's watchful eyes. The streets were deserted, cobbles glistening faintly with dew. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, so they quickened their pace, keeping to shadows until the square was behind them and the river's voice grew louder. The bridge loomed ahead, an arc of black stone draped in ivy, its outline sharp against the waning moon. They crouched in the shelter of a low wall, eyes fixed on the bridge. The current swirled noisily beneath, carrying scraps of branch and leaf. A barn owl drifted silently overhead, wings pale in the gloom, then vanished into the woods beyond. Minutes stretched into an hour. Midnight came and passed, the church bell tolling dully in the distance. The cold crept into their bones, but neither moved, their gazes fixed unwaveringly on the bridge. Then, at last, a shadow stirred. From the far end of the span, a cloaked figure emerged, gliding with furtive caution. They paused often, glancing behind, before slipping to the balustrade. With practiced movements, the figure produced a coil of rope, fastened it to the stone, and began to lower it over the side, the fibres whispering in the stillness. Tuppence gripped Tommy's sleeve. "They're fishing something out." "Or putting something in," he murmured back. They watched as the figure leaned dangerously over, hauling on the rope as though retrieving a weight from the depths. The moon caught briefly on a metal hook tied at the end, glistening before it vanished into the black water. Tommy's patience snapped. Now! They rose together, striding onto the bridge. "Good evening," Tommy called, his voice carrying with deliberate cheer. "Fishing rather late, aren't we?" The cloaked figure jerked upright, startled. For one frozen instant they stared at the intruders, then abandoned the rope entirely and bolted. "After them!" Tuppence cried. The chase was on. The figure dashed toward the village, cloak streaming behind. Their boots struck sparks from the cobbles, the echoes magnified in the sleeping streets. Tommy and Tuppence pursued, their own footsteps drumming in rhythm, breath sharp in the cold air. They veered from the square into the open fields beyond, where moonlight spilled silver across wet grass. A lantern swung wildly from the fugitive's hand, its light jerking with each stride, casting fractured shadows across hedgerows. Tommy pushed harder, closing the distance. He could hear the fugitive's breath, ragged, desperate, but the ground was treacherous, slick with dew, and more than once he nearly stumbled. Tuppence followed with steady determination, skirts dampened by the grass, her eyes never leaving the fleeing shadow. Across the meadow they went, over a stile, into a narrow lane, where overhanging trees turned moonlight into a shifting pattern of black and silver. Dogs barked from distant farms, their cries echoing. Somewhere a shutter was thrown open, but the villagers saw nothing more than fleeting shapes swallowed by the mist. At the edge of the wood, the fugitive faltered. The lantern swung low, then was dropped entirely, shattering on the stones. Darkness swallowed the chase, save for the thin silver glow of the moon overhead. Tommy lunged, fingers brushing the edge of the cloak, but the figure twisted away and plunged into the undergrowth. Branches whipped against their passage, leaves rustled violently. "Blast it," Tommy muttered, crashing after them. Tuppence was at his side, her voice steady even as her breath came quick. "Don't lose them. They'll try to circle back." But the woods were a maze, shadows layered upon shadows. The fugitive knew the ground better, slipping between trees with uncanny speed. The Beresfords gave chase, yet the distance widened. Then, suddenly, a stumble, a cry, and the sound of something striking earth. They hurried forward, but when they reached the small clearing, the fugitive was gone. Only the undergrowth swayed with recent passage, and a narrow path led deeper into darkness. They had escaped. Tuppence exhaled sharply, frustration etched in every syllable. So close. Tommy bent, his eyes catching something glinting faintly in the grass. He reached down and retrieved a pocket watch. Its chain snapped, its surface scratched from the fall. He held it up in the moonlight. "Not a total loss," he said. The watch was silver, heavy, its cover engraved with initials, E.C. Inside, the face was cracked, but still ticking faintly, as though reluctant to surrender. "Clues don't fall from the sky every night," Tommy murmured. Tuppence leaned close, her expression sharpening. E.C. Carroway, the mill owner. It must be his. "Or someone connected closely enough to carry his property," Tommy countered. "Either way, it ties our mysterious fisherman to the mill." They retraced their steps, the adrenaline of the chase slowly ebbing, replaced by the weight of discovery. The rope still dangled from the bridge when they returned, its hook swaying idly in the current. Whatever the fugitive had been retrieving now lay hidden once more beneath the river. Tommy untied the rope, examining it with care. The fibres were strong, the knot expert, suggesting practice. Not the work of an amateur. Tuppence stared into the dark waters. "The chest," she whispered. "It must be there still, and someone is desperate enough to risk everything to get at it." They hid the rope in a clump of reeds, then slipped back toward the inn before the first hints of dawn could betray them. The village remained shuttered, though one or two lamps flickered as farmers rose early for their chores. Inside their room, the watch lay on the table between them, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. The initials caught their eyes again and again, a silent accusation. Tommy stretched out his legs, rubbing at his knees from the chase. "Well, partner, we've gained a clue, lost a culprit, and ruined our best shoes. Not bad for one midnight's work." But Tuppence's gaze was fixed on the watch, her voice quiet. "We've confirmed what we suspected. This isn't just a village of secrets. It's a village of accomplices. And now, We know who one of them must be. The inn creaked around them, old timbers settling. Outside, the river rushed on, carrying with it the weight of hidden things. The bridge loomed unseen in the darkness, keeper of its chest and its crimes. Tuppence rose at last, her resolve firm. Tomorrow we confront Carroway. Whatever lies beneath that bridge he knows, and if Mrs. Vane died for it, then we will not let her death be buried in silence. Tommy pocketed the watch, his expression grim. Let's see what the mill owner has to say when we return his missing timepiece. Somehow, I suspect he won't be pleased. They extinguished the lamp, the room plunging into shadow. The village outside was beginning to stir, but within, the Beresfords lay awake, haunted by the memory of pounding footsteps, the echo of a chase through fields and woods, and the knowledge that the conspirators of Willowbrook would not rest until the past was buried forever. And yet, the night had betrayed them. Not everything had been buried. A silver watch engraved with initials ticked softly in defiance of silence. The silver pocket watch ticked faintly on the table in their room at the King's Arms, each beat of its hand as insistent as a heartbeat. Tommy and Tuppence sat opposite, the lamp throwing long shadows across their faces. The initials E.C. engraved on its case gleamed like an accusation. "It is Carroway's," Tuppence said, her voice quiet but firm. "Or if not, it belongs to someone close enough to carry his time in their pocket. Either way, it ties the bridge to him." Tommy tapped the table. "And yet, he's not the type to scramble about at midnight with ropes and lanterns. Too grand for that. He'd send someone else." "Which brings us back to Fellows," Tuppence murmured. "The curate knows more than his conscience allows him to carry. With this," she gestured to the watch, "we may just crack him." They found Mr. Fellows in the churchyard the following evening, pacing among the crooked gravestones as if they whispered accusations. His thin hands twisted together, and when he saw the Beresfords approach, he blanched as though expecting judgment. Tommy held out the watch. "Recognize this?" Fellows' eyes widened, darting to the gleaming case. His lips parted, but no words came. "It was dropped during last night's little expedition beneath the bridge," Tommy went on smoothly. "Now, unless you'd like us to assume it belongs to you, I'd suggest a little honesty." The curate swayed as though struck. His hands clutched the air helplessly before he whispered, "Please, you must not force this. I have sworn." Tuppence cut in, her tone sharp. "And how many have died for your silence, Mr. Vane? His wife? How many more, Mr. Fellows?" The curate shuddered, a man unravelling. "The chest," he breathed at last. "It lies within the bridge itself, hidden in a cavity sealed long ago. Carroway had it placed there, years back, when the first whispers began. I was made to watch, to guard. The hush money passed through my hands, dressed up as church donations. I told myself it was for the good of the parish, but my soul has never been clean since." Tuppence stepped closer, eyes unwavering. "And Mr. Vane?" Fellows buried his face in his hands. He stumbled upon it. He pried where he should not, and when he threatened to bring it to light, Carroway saw to it that the river took him. I said nothing. I have said nothing ever since. His voice cracked into sobs, echoing among the stones. Tommy's tone was cold. And Mrs. Vane? She believed her husband murdered, yet she too kept silence for years. Fellows' head jerked up, eyes red. Because she was not innocent. She accepted Carroway's payments at first, blood money to buy her comfort. It was only when the shadows grew too heavy that guilt gnawed her, and she turned fearful. Her letter to you was the act of a conscience long delayed. Tuppence recoiled slightly, the revelation cutting deep. The widow who had begged them to seek justice had once profited from the very silence she condemned. With trembling hands, Fellows led them to the bridge. The mist was heavy, moonlight dim through drifting veils. They carried lanterns, their glow carving narrow paths of light across the stones. At the midpoint, beneath the arch, the curate halted. He knelt, tugging aside ivy that clung thick as a curtain. Behind it lay a recess in the stonework, its outline faint but discernible. Tommy produced a small crowbar he had borrowed from the inn's shed. With a grunt, he wedged it into the seam and heaved. The stone shifted reluctantly, scraping against its centuries-old bed, until at last it yielded with a hollow groan. Within the cavity lay a chest, iron-bound, its surface mottled with rust and river damp. The curate flinched at the sight, crossing himself. Tommy and Tuppence hauled it out onto the stones. The lock was ancient, but the brass key fit with unnerving precision. With a turn, the mechanism clicked, and the lid creaked open. Inside lay bundles of papers, their edges curled and stained, but the writing within still legible. Names leapt from the pages. Villagers, officials, debts, bribes, receipts signed in Carraway's bold hand, notes of threats delivered, accidents arranged, silence purchased. Tuppence's breath caught. It's all here, proof enough to bring the mill crashing down. But another bundle lay beneath, letters in Mrs. Vane's script acknowledging payments, thanking Carraway for continued support. Her complicity was undeniable. For a moment, silence fell. Tuppence closed her eyes, shaken. She wasn't only a victim, she was part of it. Only at the end did her conscience wake. Tommy laid a steady hand on her shoulder. The world isn't tidy, partner. Guilt and innocence often lie tangled. A sudden sound shattered the moment, the crunch of boots on stone. They turned sharply to see Carraway himself emerge from the shadows, lantern in hand, his bulk blocking the bridge. His eyes burned with fury, fixed on the open chest. "So," he growled, "you've pried too far." He advanced, and with a swift motion kicked at the chest, sending papers scattering toward the water. Tuppence cried out, diving to gather them, while Tommy stepped squarely into Carraway's path. "That's enough," Tommy said firmly. But Carraway's rage was unchecked. "You meddling fools! Do you think you can tear down what I built? This village lives by my mill. Better a few silenced than ruin for all." He seized the chest, straining to heave it toward the parapet. For an instant it teetered, the rusted iron groaning. Then Tommy lunged, grappling him. They struggled, the lantern swinging wildly, casting crazed shadows across the bridge. "Tommy!" Tuppence cried. She snatched up the scattered papers, clutching them to her chest. Fellows stood frozen, pale and useless, muttering prayers. With a final wrench, Tommy forced Carraway back, the chest clattering to the stones. The man stumbled, rage blazing, then turned as though to seize the lantern and dash it into the papers. But Tuppence stepped forward, voice ringing clear. "Enough, Mr. Carraway. You've already drowned one man, perhaps two. You'll not drown the truth." Her words struck like a lash. Carraway froze, his breath heaving, eyes darting from the papers to their resolute faces. Then, with a guttural snarl, he wrenched free and fled into the mist, his heavy footsteps fading down the lane. Silence reclaimed the bridge, save for the rush of the river and the flutter of disturbed papers. Tommy bent, gathering them with swift precision. Tuppence's hands trembled as she replaced them in the chest. "We have enough. Enough to expose him, to clear the Vane's story. But it's not clean, Tommy. It never was." He met her gaze, sober. "Justice rarely is, Tuppence, but truth we can still deliver." The curate sank to his knees, head bowed. "May God forgive us all," he whispered. Lantern light flickered across the bridge's ancient stones, now witness not only to secrecy but to revelation. The chest, once hidden in silence, now lay open to the night, its contents a testimony carved in ink rather than stone. And as they bore it away toward the inn, Tuppence felt the weight of more than rusted iron and paper. She carried also the widow's final plea, twisted though it had been, a plea not only for justice but for absolution. The river surged beneath them, its voice endless, as though promising that truth, like water, would always find its way through stone. The storm came sweeping over Willowbrook like a predator. By nightfall the sky was a welter of bruised clouds, thunder rolling across the hills, rain lashing the river into froth. Lanterns flickered in windows, doors barred tight. Yet high upon the rise, the great house of Edmund Carraway blazed with light, its tall windows glowing defiantly against the storm. Tommy and Tuppence ascended the drive, cloaks whipping, the iron-bound chest carried between them with grim determination. Beside them walked Constable Briggs, his cap pulled low against the weather, jaw set with the resolve of a man at last stepping out of silence. Trailing reluctantly was the curate, Mr. Fellows, his thin frame trembling as though the thunder itself shook him. "Courage," Tuppence whispered as they mounted the steps. "It's tonight or never." The door was opened not by a servant but by Carroway himself. His bulk filled the frame, his face set in scorn. "So, the meddling pair return, and you bring an entourage. Shall we call it a circus?" "We'll call it justice," Tommy said crisply, stepping inside without invitation. Rain streamed from his coat as he set the chest squarely on the marble floor of the hall. Carroway's eyes flickered to it, and though his expression remained composed, a muscle jumped in his jaw. "You should have left that where it belonged. Buried." The constable cleared his throat, voice rough. "Mr. Carroway, we'll have answers. Tonight." They entered the drawing room, its high ceiling echoing with the storm outside. Fire roared in the grate, casting wild light across oil paintings of long-dead Carroways. Shadows leapt across velvet drapes, and the scent of cigar smoke lingered. The innkeeper, Dobbs, sat uneasily in a chair near the fire. He started when the Beresfords entered, eyes darting between them and his employer. "So," Tuppence said softly, "all of Carroway's hounds gathered under one roof." Dobbs half rose. "I don't know what you mean," but Tommy cut him short, flipping open the chest. Papers spilled across the carpet, ledgers, receipts, letters inked in Mrs. Vane's hand. The storm rattled the windows as if urging the moment forward. Tuppence's voice rang clear. "This is the heart of it. Bribes, hush money, threats. A history of corruption carved into ink. And the names, yours among them, Carroway. Mr. Vane discovered it, and for that he was drowned. His widow tried to speak, and for that she too was silenced." Carroway's eyes flashed. "Lies." But Fellows stepped forward, pale but steady. "No, sir. I saw it. I stood by as you sealed the chest into the bridge. I took your money and told myself it was for the parish roof, but it was blood money, and I am done with silence." The constable added, his voice grim, "And I suspected all along, though I lacked proof. You've hidden behind respectability too long, Carroway." For a moment, Carroway was motionless. Then, with a sudden laugh, he leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming. "Very well. Yes, I paid. Yes, I silenced. And why? Because this village lives and dies by the mill. Had I allowed scandal to touch it, all of Willowbrook would have starved. You call it corruption, I call it survival." Tuppence's tone cut like steel. "And what of the Vanes? Were their lives acceptable sacrifices to your survival?" He sneered. Vane was a fool, shouting of exposure when he owed half his comfort to my generosity. And his wife, his wife was happy enough to take her share until guilt gnawed her in old age. Do not paint her a saint. The words struck Tuppence hard, confirming the moral tangle she already dreaded. Yet she steadied herself, eyes unwavering. "Guilt may come late, Mr. Carroway, but truth comes nonetheless." All eyes turned as Tommy lifted another paper, one scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. "And here's our accomplice, Dobbs. You weren't merely the innkeeper who poured the ale and minded your own business. You shadowed us, tampered with the ledger, tried to steer suspicion to a phantom salesman." Dobbs' face drained of colour. I only did as I was told." Carroway's hand slammed the arm of his chair. "Fool! You dropped the watch, didn't you? I trusted you to fetch the chest, and you bungled it." Dobbs flinched, eyes darting to the constable. "He made me, Briggs. He said if I didn't help, the mill would close, my debts would be called. I had no choice." The constable's voice was hard. "There is always a choice, Dobbs, and tonight you'll answer for yours." Suddenly Carroway surged to his feet, hand flashing to the drawer of a side table. From it he drew a revolver, the metal gleaming in the firelight. The curate gave a strangled cry, the innkeeper shrank back, and the constable froze, hand inching toward his baton. Carroway levelled the weapon at the Beresfords. His voice was calm, almost weary. "You two should never have come. You don't understand the weight of a village, the ruin that truth can bring. Better one stormy night than the destruction of all I've built." Thunder cracked overhead, rattling the windows. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Then Tommy moved. With deceptive ease, he stepped sideways, words flowing even as his hands shifted. "A fine speech, Carroway. But you've miscalculated. You think power rests in fear, in silence, It doesn't. It rests in people willing to stand against you. His hand shot out, seizing Carraway's wrist. The revolver discharged with a deafening crack, the shot burying itself harmlessly in the plaster. The smell of gunpowder filled the room. They struggled, shadows lurching crazily with each flash of lightning. At last, with a wrench, Tommy forced the revolver free and flung it onto the hearthrug, where the constable swiftly snatched it up. Carraway staggered, chest heaving, eyes blazing with impotent fury. It was Fellows who stepped forward then, voice trembling but resolute. "I will testify. I will tell all I saw, all I did. No more silence, no more cowardice." For the first time, Carraway's bravado faltered. He looked around the room, the constable armed, the curate defiant, the Beresfords unyielding, and something in him sagged. The storm outside roared, but inside his empire of shadows crumbled. Dobbs moaned softly, burying his face in his hands. The constable spoke firmly. "Edmund Carraway, you'll answer for these crimes, both of you." No resistance remained. Carraway sank into his chair, head bowed, the firelight etching deep lines of defeat into his face. Hours later, when the revolver had been locked away, the papers secured, and the prisoners taken into custody, Tommy and Tuppence stood once more at the door of the great house. The storm had begun to ease, rain slackening, thunder rolling farther away across the hills. Tuppence drew her cloak tighter, gazing back at the house. "It's strange, isn't it? Justice feels less triumphant than I expected." Tommy smiled wryly. "Because it's not neat. Carraway thought himself a saviour. The widow was both guilty and aggrieved. Fellows complicit until the last moment. Justice here isn't clean. It rarely is. But it's done." They descended the steps, the chest between them once more. Its weight lighter now that its secrets were spoken. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, a village washed but not wholly cleansed. As they walked back toward the inn, Tuppence looked at Tommy, her voice quiet. "We've pulled truth from beneath the stones, but the river will never give back the lives it took." "No," Tommy said gently, "but perhaps it will carry their story forward, and perhaps the bridge will stand lighter for no longer bearing the weight of secrets." The storm clouds parted, and a ragged moon broke through, casting silver across the wet road. Side by side, the Beresfords walked on, the night at last giving way to dawn. Morning broke more gently over Willowbrook than it had in days. The storm had passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean, the sky a pale wash of blue streaked with the soft blush of dawn. Mist still clung to the river, but it was thinner now, drifting in ribbons that caught the light rather than swallowing it. The village seemed to exhale at last, though its sigh was weary. From their room at the King's Arms, Tommy and Tuppence looked out upon a square slowly returning to life. A farmer rattled by with his cart, the inn's maid shook a rug from an upper window, and even the church bell sounded less like a warning than a summons to ordinary duties. "Funny thing," Tommy remarked as he fastened his cufflinks, "you'd think after a scandal of this size there'd be chaos in the streets. Pitchforks, torches, at the very least. Instead, everyone looks relieved." Tuppence tied her hat ribbon beneath her chin. "That's the nature of secrets. They weigh most heavily on those forced to keep them. The villagers are lighter now, though their peace is not without cost." She turned from the window, her expression tinged with melancholy. Later they walked the lanes, their presence greeted with cautious nods. The constable, more upright than they had ever seen him, strode past with a purposeful air, a small procession of men carrying sealed boxes of evidence from Carraway's house. Dobbs, the innkeeper, sat hunched on a bench outside the constabulary, his head in his hands, shame his only cloak. Mr. Fellows passed them in the churchyard, his step lighter, though his face still bore the traces of sleepless nights. He paused, inclining his head. "You have freed me," he said quietly, "not from guilt, it will haunt me always, but from the burden of silence. Perhaps now I may begin to serve honestly." Tuppence offered a gentle smile. "Confession is not absolution, Mr. Fellows, but it is a beginning. Make it count." He bowed, tears bright in his eyes, and went on his way. At the mill, the great chimney stood silent, the gates barred. A few workers loitered uncertainly, their livelihood suspended with their employer awaiting trial. Yet even among them, There was no despair, only the cautious optimism of people who had long suspected rot and now hoped for renewal. As evening drew near, Tommy and Tuppence made their way once more to the Willow Bridge. Its stones, washed clean by the storm, glistened in the fading light. The ivy clung stubbornly, yet even that seemed less oppressive now, the air fresher without the weight of secrets pressing from its shadow. They stood side by side, gazing at the river below. Its waters, swollen from rain, now ran calmer, carrying only driftwood and light. Tommy leaned against the balustrade, hands in pockets. "I've been thinking, partner. Evil doesn't always roar into town on a motorcar, brandishing knives and revolvers. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, like damp. In villages like this, where people assume nothing ever happens, that's where it grows best. In silence, in complacency." Tuppence's eyes remained on the water, her voice soft but certain. "And in fear. Fear of poverty, fear of shame, fear of losing what little one has. Carraway built his fortress on those fears. Even Mrs. Vane, poor soul, profited by it once, and when she tried to undo it, it was too late." They were silent a moment, listening to the steady murmur of the current. "At least," Tommy said at last, "the truth's out. The mill will be rebuilt in time. Fellows will learn to look his flock in the eye, and the villagers will walk lighter, that's something." Tuppence nodded. Her gaze drifted to the arch beneath them, where shadows pooled. "But the bridge will remember. Its stones have borne too much. Secrets don't vanish just because they're spoken. They leave marks, on places and on people." She touched the balustrade gently, as though acknowledging its burden. The following morning, as the mist lifted once more, they prepared to leave. The constable came to see them off, standing awkwardly by the station platform. "You've done this village a service," he said gruffly. "We'll see to it Carraway faces justice. And Dobbs, too. Can't promise we'll thank you kindly. Folk don't much like outsiders digging in their soil, but, well, we're better for it." Tommy clapped him on the shoulder. "Just see the job through. That'll be thanks enough." The curate, too, appeared, his thin frame more upright than before. He pressed a small Bible into Tuppence's hands. "A token," he said, "for reminding me that silence is the worst sin of all." Tuppence accepted it with a nod, though her eyes glimmered with sadness. The train approached, its whistle cutting through the valley. Steam billowed, bright against the morning light. They boarded, settling into their compartment as the engine heaved forward. Through the window, the last sight of Willowbrook was the outline of the bridge, standing steadfast above the river, mist curling about its base like memory itself. As the countryside slipped past, Tommy leaned back, stretching his legs. Another case wrapped, another set of villains neatly tied for the judge. But I confess, Tuppence, this one leaves me thoughtful. Too many shades of grey for comfort. She gazed out at the rolling fields, her voice soft. "That's because truth is never tidy. We solved the mystery, yes, but not the pain behind it. Mrs. Vane sought justice, but she also sought forgiveness. I don't know if she found either." Tommy reached across, covering her hand with his. "What she found was someone willing to listen at last. That may be the best anyone can do." The train rattled on, wheels steady against the rails. Tuppence turned from the window, offering a faint smile. "Perhaps," she said. "The river is calmer now because some ghosts have found rest. Not all, but enough." And with that thought, they let the rhythm of the train carry them onward, leaving Willowbrook behind but not forgotten. Another chapter of mystery closed, another truth uncovered, its mark indelible upon both the place and the seekers who had dared to find it.